6 years of my life were tied to that company, and over time I stopped noticing how deeply it was shaping everything about me. Early mornings that blurred into late nights, meetings where I spoke but rarely felt heard, and a constant quiet pressure that no matter how much effort I gave, I would always remain slightly outside the circle that actually mattered, especially under one man's shadow, Buck Harmon, my father-in-law, who didn't just run the company, but controlled the atmosphere inside it like it was an extension of his own authority, where every decision bent toward his approval and every silence felt like a warning. And I learned something early that never changed. Respect in his world wasn't earned, it was assigned. And I was never someone he assigned it to. And before I go further, welcome to Dad True Revenge, where every story exposes betrayal, power, and the moment people finally face the consequences they thought would never come. If you enjoy real emotional revenge stories, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I read every comment and it actually helps shape future stories. Now back to the moment everything started to shift, because it didn't begin with a fight or a warning. It began on an ordinary afternoon when I was searching through a filing cabinet on the 18th floor for a missing contract, already frustrated and ready to walk away, until I pulled out an old dust-covered folder that clearly didn't belong there, something forgotten or intentionally hidden, and for a moment I almost ignored it, like everything else in that building taught me to do. But I didn't. I opened it, and inside were founding documents of Harmon, equity partners filled with dense legal language and structured clauses. Most people would never read twice, but I read them carefully once, then again slower, until I reached a buried section that described long-term service, termination conditions, and equity entitlement in a way that didn't match anything I had ever been told about my role. And what made it worse was the realization that Buck Harmon, the man who controlled everything in that company, had likely never read this section at all, not even once. And in that quiet moment, nothing changed outside, but inside me, something locked into place. Because I wasn't just reading paperwork anymore, I was reading leverage. And for the first time I understood that everything I thought was permanent inside that company might not be permanent at all. Buck Harmon wasn't just powerful inside the company. He was the kind of man who made people adjust their tone before they even realized they were speaking differently around him. A presence that filled every hallway long before he entered it. And in meetings he didn't need to raise his voice because silence itself became a form of control when he was in the room. And I learned quickly that people didn't disagree with Buck Harmon. They survived him, carefully choosing words like they were walking across thin glass. While I sat in that environment every day, trying to stay invisible enough not to become a target, but present enough not to disappear completely. And over time, I started noticing a pattern that no one else seemed willing to admit. He didn't respect competence, he respected compliance, and anyone who showed too much independence eventually became a problem waiting to be corrected. And that was when I began to understand that my position in the company wasn't stable at all. It was conditional, even fragile. But what I didn't know yet was that fragility could be used both ways. And the same system that made people fear him might also contain the very thing that could one day undo him. It started with small things, the kind most people ignore because they don't seem important enough to question, like the way Buck would refer to me in meetings not by my name but as if I were an extension of someone else's decision. Sport, or my son-in-law instead of Craig. And at first I told myself it didn't matter, that titles were just habits. But over time I realized it was intentional. A way of keeping distance without ever having to explain it, and what made it worse was how everyone else adapted to it, like the room had silently agreed that I didn't need to be fully recognized to be functional, and that slow erosion of identity inside a corporate structure started to affect me more than I wanted to admit, because when a man stops being called by his name, he starts questioning whether he ever truly had one in that place to begin with. And yet I stayed quiet, not because I accepted it, but because I was watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when silence would become more powerful than speaking. The more I went back to those founding documents, the more I realized the clause wasn't accidental or decorative. It was structured with precision, almost like a hidden mechanism designed to activate under very specific conditions, tied to years of service, termination without documented cause, and valuation rules that didn't match the way anyone in the company talked about compensation. And what made it dangerous wasn't just what it promised, but how easily it could be triggered if the right conditions aligned. And I began doing something I had never done before. Not just working inside the system, but studying it like an outsider trying to understand how it could be broken. And slowly a thought started forming that I didn't speak out loud to anyone, not even myself at first, because once it was said it couldn't be undone, and that thought was simple but heavy. If Buck Harmon ever pushed me out the wrong way, the consequences would not be emotional or professional. They would be structural, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about staying in the company. I was thinking about what would happen if the company had to respond to me instead. I thought I was hiding it well. The shift in how I was observing everything. The way I stopped reacting emotionally in meetings. The way I started writing things down that I used to ignore. But Shelby noticed before anyone else did, because she had grown up around men like her father and understood the difference between frustration and calculation. And one night at dinner, she looked at me longer than usual, not asking questions but studying me like she already knew I was no longer thinking like an employee. And when I finally spoke about the documents, I expected disbelief or concern, but she didn't react that way at all. Instead, she went quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from recognition. And when she finally spoke, her words weren't emotional. They were precise, almost cold, as if she had already been carrying her own version of the same truth for years. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a history inside her family that had never fully been resolved, only managed, and now it was starting to surface again in a way no one could control anymore. After Shelby saw what I was becoming, something changed in the way I moved through every day inside that company. Not openly, not in a way anyone could point to, but internally, like a switch had been flipped that made me see every interaction differently. Every meeting, every comment, every small decision from Buck Harmon now carried a second meaning beneath the surface. And I stopped reacting like an employee and started observing, like someone collecting evidence, without ever calling it that. And the strangest part was how normal it all still looked on the outside. Because no one suspects danger when it's dressed in routine. But inside me, I was no longer just surviving the environment. I was studying it, timing it, understanding exactly how it responded when pressure was applied in the smallest possible ways. It started with subtle changes, nothing obvious enough to challenge authority directly, but enough to see how Buck would react when control was slightly disturbed, like questioning a decision in a meeting with calm data instead of agreement, or delaying responses by minutes instead of seconds, or refusing to laugh at comments that everyone else treated as harmless. And each time I did it, I watched him closely, not for anger, but for patterns. Because powerful men rarely show you their weakness directly. They show you through repetition. And what I noticed was that Buck didn't tolerate independence, even in its smallest form. And the more consistent I became in my behavior, the more I could see his attention shifting toward me in ways it hadn't before. Not openly hostile yet, but no longer dismissive either. And that change told me something important. The system had started to register me differently to everyone else. Buck Harmon was confidence, authority, and experience wrapped into one figure who seemed unshakable. But the longer I watched him closely, the more I started to see something else underneath that surface. A need for control that wasn't just professional but personal, like the company wasn't just his achievement but his identity. And any challenge to it felt like a challenge to him as a person, not just a leader. And that realization changed the way I interpreted every interaction we had, because I understood now that I wasn't dealing with rational leadership. I was dealing with ego disguised as structure. And ego like that doesn't respond to logic, it responds to pressure, timing, and discomfort. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to fit into his system and started thinking about how systems like his eventually collapse from within. The most dangerous part of everything I was building wasn't action. It was restraint. Because every instinct I had at the beginning told me to confront what I was seeing, to question it directly, to push back in a way that would make things clearer faster. But instead, I did the opposite. I stayed quiet. I stayed consistent. And I let time do what emotion never could. And slowly I began to realize that patience inside a controlled environment is not weakness, it is observation in motion. And every day I continued working normally, while internally mapping how Buck reacted to pressure, disagreement, and silence. Until I understood something very clearly. He didn't fear mistakes. He feared losing control of perception. And once I knew that, everything I did from that point forward was designed around one principle. Never challenge him directly, only shape the conditions that would eventually make him challenge himself. It didn't happen all at once, but I started noticing small changes in how Buck treated me. Not respect, never that, but attention. The kind that comes when a man who used to ignore you suddenly begins to register your presence as a variable he didn't account for. and it showed in the smallest details. A longer pause when I spoke in meetings, a second look after I finished a report, the way his questions started becoming less dismissive and more investigative, as if he was trying to understand whether I was still just an employee or something else he hadn't identified yet. And what made it more interesting was that I didn't change my behavior in a way that was visible. I simply continued doing my job with the same consistency, but now with awareness behind every action. Because I realized something important. Once a man like Buck starts paying attention to you, you are no longer invisible. Which means you are also no longer safe. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even Shelby, when I decided to quietly confirm what I had found, because I understood that assumptions in a situation like this were dangerous, so I reached out indirectly, through professional channels, until I was connected to someone who actually understood corporate founding structures, a lawyer who didn't speak in opinions but in certainty, and when I showed her the document, I watched her expression change in real time. Not dramatically, but enough to tell me she had recognized exactly what it meant. And after a long silence, she confirmed what I already suspected, that the clause wasn't just real, it was enforceable under very specific conditions, and more importantly, it was structured in a way that most executives would never think to question until it was too late. And in that moment I understood something critical. This wasn't just a loophole, it was a locked door that only opened when someone was pushed out the wrong way. That confirmation changed everything. Because suddenly my past 6 years weren't just experience or loyalty or career growth. They were a timer I had unknowingly been walking through, and every year I had stayed in that company without incident had been quietly moving me closer to something I didn't even know existed. And when I looked back at it through that lens, I started seeing patterns that didn't feel random anymore. Performance reviews that were intentionally neutral, responsibilities that kept me close but never fully in control, even moments where Buck had the opportunity to remove me but didn't. And I realized something unsettling. Either he didn't understand the structure of his own company, or he believed so completely in his control that he never imagined it could be used against him. And that uncertainty was the first real advantage I ever had over him. After I understood what the clause really meant, nothing about my life changed on the surface, but internally every decision started aligning toward one silent direction, because I realized I wasn't dealing with a moment anymore, I was dealing with timing. And timing inside a system like Buck Harmon's world is everything, so I kept showing up the same way, same suit, same routine, same tone, but my attention shifted completely. Every meeting became a test. Every comment became data. Every reaction from Buck became information I could use later. And the most dangerous part was that nobody around me suspected anything, because nothing visible had changed. But inside, I had already accepted something I never said out loud to anyone. That I was no longer trying to survive this job. I was preparing for the moment it would end. Shelby noticed the shift before I explained anything further, because she understood her father in ways most people never could. Not just as a businessman, but as a pattern of behavior repeated over decades. And one evening she stopped asking me what I was planning, and instead started talking like she already understood the direction things were heading. And that silence between us became something heavier than conversation, because it meant alignment without explanation. And when I finally showed her the full structure of what I had found, she didn't react with surprise or fear, she reacted with recognition. Like she had always known there was something inside that company waiting to surface. And now, it finally had a shape. The first real crack didn't come from confrontation. It came from overconfidence, because Buck started treating my consistency as harmless predictability, assuming that someone who never caused problems would never become one. And that assumption made him loosen his attention in small ways, not fully, but enough for me to notice. And I realized something important about powerful people like him. They don't watch everything, they watch what they think is changing, and once they categorize you as stable, they stop questioning your behavior deeply, which means stability itself becomes camouflage, and that was exactly what I had been building without announcing it. By the time everything started moving toward the outside world, the plan was no longer something I was thinking about in parts. It had become a complete structure in my mind. Every step connected, every reaction anticipated, every possible outcome mapped, and what made it dangerous wasn't speed or aggression, but patience. Because I had already accepted that this wasn't about forcing anything, it was about creating conditions where the system would trigger itself, where Buck's own decisions would eventually activate something he never prepared for. And once I understood that, I stopped feeling like I was playing against him directly. and started feeling like I was simply letting time expose what had always been hidden inside his control. The idea of Paris didn't come from me, it came from Shelby. But the moment it was said out loud, I understood exactly why it would work. Because Buck Harmon didn't just monitor performance, he monitored presence. And nothing unsettled a man like him, more than people he believed he could control suddenly existing outside his reach. And what made it even more effective was that it didn't look like a strategy. It looked like normal life, an approved vacation, a legitimate absence, something completely harmless on paper. But in reality, it created the exact condition we needed: distance, silence, and just enough uncertainty to make a man like Buck start reacting instead of controlling. It didn't take long after we left for him to start noticing the gap. Because people like Buck don't process absence calmly, they process it as disruption, and disruption inside their world feels like disrespect. And I could see it building through indirect channels first. Small updates, delayed reactions, messages that carried more tension than usual. Until finally it reached the point where he couldn't contain it anymore, and he called, not politely, not professionally, but emotionally, and I let him speak. I let every word come out the way he wanted, because I wasn't listening for information anymore. I was listening for confirmation that the pressure was working exactly as intended. By the time the call ended, something important had already shifted. Not in me, but in him. Because Buck Harmon had spent his entire life controlling outcomes through presence, intimidation, and structure. But now for the first time, none of those tools were working. And that lack of control began showing up in ways even he couldn't fully hide. Shorter patience, sharper assumptions, quicker anger beneath calm sentences. And what he didn't realize was that every reaction he gave was becoming part of the same pattern I had been building toward. Because when a man like Buck starts reacting emotionally instead of strategically, he stops being unpredictable in a dangerous way and starts becoming predictable in a useful one. Paris looked like a break to everyone watching from the outside. A normal vacation, a couple finally stepping away from years of work pressure. But for me, it was never about rest. It was about distance. Because distance changes how power behaves. And I needed Buck Harmon to feel that shift without being able to control it. And the longer we stayed away, the more I could see the pattern forming exactly as expected. Because silence in his world wasn't peace, it was uncertainty. And uncertainty was something he had never learned how to tolerate without trying to fix it immediately. By the 8th day, the reaction was no longer subtle. It had fully formed into frustration, and I could feel it even before the call came. Because people like Buck don't wait patiently when their control feels threatened, they escalate. And when the phone finally rang, I didn't rush to answer it. I let it sit for a moment in my hand while I looked at Shelby. Because we both already knew what this was. Not a conversation, not a check-in, but a breaking point. And when I finally picked up, I wasn't nervous, I was ready. Because everything had been designed for this exact moment of pressure release. His voice came through immediately, sharp and loud, carrying that familiar authority that used to make entire rooms adjust themselves automatically. But this time something was different, because I didn't respond the way I used to. I didn't rush, I didn't justify, I didn't defend. I simply listened until he had nothing left but frustration, and in that space I could hear it clearly for the first time. The edge in his tone that wasn't confidence anymore. It was irritation trying to disguise itself as control. And when he finally demanded that I come back immediately, I realized something important had happened. He wasn't giving instructions anymore, he was reacting. And that difference meant the system was already shifting in ways he couldn't see yet. Coming back to Savannah wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the part that actually mattered. Because everything that happened in Paris was pressure. But what happens after pressure is where systems reveal their real structure. And as the plane landed and the city came back into view, I could already feel the weight of what was waiting inside that building on the 18th floor. Not as fear, but as inevitability. Because Buck Harmon didn't understand yet that the situation had already moved beyond personal conflict. It had entered documentation, structure, and consequence. And those are things ego can't negotiate with once they are triggered. Walking into the building again felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. And every step toward the 18th floor felt less like returning to work and more like entering a system that was about to evaluate itself. And when I stepped into the conference room, the silence wasn't normal silence. It was the kind that forms when people already sense something irreversible is about to happen. And Buck was there waiting. But for the first time, he didn't look like he was controlling the room. He looked like he was trying to hold it together, and that difference told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. The moment the clause was brought forward, everything inside that room shifted in real time. Not emotionally first, but structurally, because legal reality doesn't respond to authority, it responds to conditions, and as the documents were placed on the table and read aloud, I watched Buck try every version of control he had left. Anger, denial, dismissal, but none of it changed the math, and for the first time in his life inside that company, the room didn't move with him. It moved against him. And when silence finally settled again, I understood something very clearly. This was never about revenge in the emotional sense, it was about alignment. Because once a system is forced to acknowledge its own rules, even the most powerful man inside it stops being untouchable. The days after the board meeting didn't feel like victory. They felt like pressure slowly changing direction. Because once a system like that starts to acknowledge its own rules, it doesn't explode immediately. It recalibrates. And I could see it happening inside every corner of Harmon Equity Partners, meetings getting quieter, decisions getting delayed, and people who once spoke freely now choosing their words like they were walking through a legal minefield, while Buck Harmon sat in the middle of it all trying to do what he had always done. Reassert control through presence. But this time presence wasn't enough. Because what had been triggered wasn't emotion, it was structure, and structure doesn't respond to authority, it responds to enforcement. And for the first time in decades, Buck wasn't the center of the system anymore. He was inside it like everyone else. It didn't happen in one moment. It happened in fragments. First came the legal confirmations, then the internal reviews, then the outside counsel opinions that no longer protected interpretation but confirmed exposure. And slowly the board stopped behaving like a group waiting for Buck's direction, and started behaving like a group preparing for separation. And I watched him notice it in real time. The subtle loss of influence that doesn't announce itself loudly but removes itself quietly from every conversation, every decision, every glance across the table that no longer waited for his approval. And that was when I realized something important. Buck Harmon had spent his entire life believing he was the system, but now the system was continuing without him. I never watched it end the way people expect stories like this to end. No dramatic collapse, no final confrontation, just a slow, irreversible shift, where everything eventually settled into what it was always meant to be, under the rules that were written long before any of us entered the picture. And when the final agreement was signed and the numbers were settled, I didn't feel celebration. I felt closure, because the clause wasn't about destroying someone. It was about revealing what was already true beneath the surface. And as Shelby and I left Savannah for the last time, I finally understood something I didn't understand at the beginning. Revenge was never the point. Accountability was. And once that balance was restored, there was nothing left to fight for. Only somewhere else to go, and that's where it all ends. Not with chaos, but with truth finally catching up to power that thought it would never be questioned. If you made it to the end of this story, you already understand what this really was. Control, patience, and consequences unfolding in silence, long before anyone realized the game had changed. If you want more stories like this, slow-burning revenge, corporate power struggles, and emotional payback that hits where it hurts, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dad True Revenge, and drop a comment telling me which part hit you the hardest. Because the next story might be even more ruthless than this one.